This is a friend of mine, John Alsop, who is an Australian software developer, web standards type person. And I remember at one of my very first web conferences in 2005, much like last night, we were drinking a lot of beer and talking with John, and we started talking about the web and how accessible it is and how it's not accessible, and we started getting into these philosophical debates about whose job accessibility is. And one of the things that really hit home with me when John said this was he looked at me just like he was on the screen here, and he held up his finger kind of telling me, he said, "Derek, the web is already accessible, and the things that you do to it as you're building and designing take that accessibility away." And that really hit home for me, because it was something where I just kind of thought that I was building websites, I was designing things, I was coding things, and I wasn't really nearly as aware of the inherent accessibility that is in the web. The web is already flexible. And if you take a look at any browser, this is one of my favorite passages from John's article, A Tao of Web Design. This is his conclusion. It's basically, the web's greatest strength, I believe, is often seen as a limitation, as a defect. It is the nature of the web to be flexible. If you take a look at content and put it in a browser, it has no bounds. It takes up whatever space the browser has available. And so when you shrink the browser, it wraps and it fits to that space. And we start to constrain it by putting boxes around things and giving them fixed widths or even percentage widths. We create some of that inherent inaccessibility just by some of the actions that we take as designers and developers. And John's philosophy has always been, and I think it's really very fitting, in order to be accessible, we need to be flexible. And that's one of the best things about responsive design. So how many of you, and I'm hoping that everybody is really on board with responsive and is working in some way to work on responsive designs? Hands up, yes? Okay, what's up with the rest of you? Why not? You're not allowed to? You don't want to? You want to go back to drinking again? Either way, it's fine. The beauty of responsive design and accessibility, to me, is that they both embrace flexibility. And there's a lot of people that talk about how responsive and accessibility go together hand in hand. They're these two wonderful pieces of what we craft on the web, accessibility and responsive design, and that they go together. And they do. They have very, very similar philosophical underpinnings. And it all starts with this flexibility. But responsive design isn't automatically accessible, right? It doesn't just happen because you created a responsive design. It doesn't just mean automatically that everything is going to be accessible. And that can be said for a lot of different things. That can be said for mobile-first design. Right, we talk about designing for mobile first, and then I think Andy Clark has a phrase that he uses, 320 and up. Right, he starts at 320 and works with that, and then builds to the next larger size for tablets, and then he builds to the next size. The mobile first design doesn't automatically become accessible either, and even using web standards isn't automatically accessible. Writing valid code used to be this thing that everybody would look at and say, well, it's valid code, so it's accessible, right? And that's just not true. It's plain not true. Using web standards doesn't make something automatically accessible. And looking at all of these things and having an understanding of this and seeing different projects where people have used web standards, where they've used mobile-first design, where they've used responsive design techniques, and seeing that those things aren't actually accessible, basically is kind of what brings me to these conclusions today. And so this is me. I'm Feather at simplyaccessible.com. I'm Feather on Twitter. If you want to connect with me there, that's fantastic. If you don't, that's fine too. I'm Canadian, and so I will probably apologize to you if you don't want to talk to me. It's totally fine. We do a lot of work. We do a lot of work with companies that are really pushing on the responsive side of things right now, and so we're seeing a lot of things. And one of the things that I want to do is share some stories with you, these accessibility lessons from the field that I think are really important to doing responsive in the right way. So the first one, some of these aren't one of the things that has become clear to me over the last 6 months is that a lot of these principles apply both to the work that we do on the desktop or in a desktop browser. They're exactly the same principles that apply on the mobile browsers. So understanding proximity is a really important lesson. This is in a shower in London, in England, and this shower confuses me because I have a hot water tap on the left and I have a hot water tap on the right. Doesn't make sense to me, and it didn't make sense until I saw this instruction that the left tap operates the shower and the right tap operates the bath. Now, it makes more sense. I at least know if I'm going to burn my head or my feet, right? The problem with this interface is that the taps are down there and those instructions are way up there, right? Those two things need to be together. That is the principle of proximity, right? Things that are related to one another need to be grouped together. They need to be closely grouped. So those instructions really should be down in the line of sight when I'm looking at that shower, right? When I'm looking at those faucets. So as it turns out, it's actually completely wrong. You see here, since I can walk up here, there's two taps, but there's another dial in the middle that actually determines the temperature, and the two taps on each side shouldn't have been red at all because it's really just an on-off switch. So, I mean, just horrible. And I froze myself. I didn't actually burn myself. So we need to group closely related items, and we see this in web interfaces all the time. And this is something where when we solve problems for people with disabilities, we tend to solve them for mobile, and we tend to make them better for everyone. This is a scenario we worked on with one of our clients. It's a fairly straightforward form. It was coded perfectly to web standards. It used Legend, it used field set, it had labels for all the radio buttons. It was a pretty standard form. And when you take a look at this form, you can see that it's in multiple columns. We have the questions on the left, the radio buttons on the right, and then on the far right we have these open tips links that expose some extra content that help people to get the details of what these questions are actually asking about. When you think about how somebody needs to work with this form in order to fill it out, they actually have to look at these questions and then go over to the radio buttons, and then look at the questions and go over to the radio buttons. Questions, radios, questions, radios. We create this pattern just by the way that this is laid out on the screen, that the person has to do more work. Now for us, if we have relatively normal vision, that's not a big deal, that back and forth. It's not a big deal. But to somebody that has low vision and that needs to magnify the screen, you can see how this quickly becomes a completely unusable interface, because now I've got the questions here in one chunk, and by the time I scroll over to those radio buttons to get at the radio buttons, I've lost the context of the questions. Right? It's very simple. This is a huge problem for people with low vision. And one of the groups that is really well served by responsive design techniques is people with low vision. So this chunking of information and the way that it's laid out on the screen actually has a significant impact on people with low vision. So when we redesigned this form, we set it up so that the chunks were still there, but they were all in this vertical stack. So that the chunks weren't question and question, radios and radios, question and question, radios and radios. It was the question with the associated radio buttons, and then the next question and radio button set, and then the next, and then the next. Right? We've also set this up so that the next button, as you see, and the alignment may be different. You may want a different alignment. You may design something so that it's slightly different. But notice that that vertical stack exists, and then when we get to the end of the radio buttons, we just continue to scroll down, and we see the next button. That big call to action is right there, and it's very prominent and very dominant. When we are scrolled in or zoomed in on that, this vertical stack is a huge help to us. We want to embrace in responsive designs that vertical stack, and that manifests itself in a lot of different ways. We should be, for somebody that has low vision, we should be doing this in many, many different ways. This is on OS 10. One of the things that somebody with low vision can do on OS 10 is they can highlight content, right-click on it or context click and say start speaking, so that that content can be read out to them so that they don't have to read it. For somebody that has low vision, their eyes may get tired really, really easily. Kind of like right now. Are your eyes tired? They are. Your eyes are closed, aren't they? Hang on a second. Okay. So we have that ability to highlight content and then to start to tell the operating system to read it to me because I have low vision, I might have eye strain. I want you to take a look at this. Notice the layout of this context menu. Right? When I click, I have a speech option, I get this start speaking. And I want you to see what this looks like when I'm actually zoomed in. When I'm using the built-in magnifier into OS 10, this is what that looks like. So you can see, sorry about the shakes. So when I highlight this content and I right-click and say, go down to the speech section, because I'm zoomed in, that context menu is now off the screen. It's not even within my visible viewport. And to work to get over there is really difficult. Right? It's very finicky. Because you're at such a zoomed-in magnification, it becomes very difficult. Your mouse movements become very fine. Right? So this is actually, I just think this is bad design in OS 10, right? Because at this level, the operating system should know that I'm zoomed in, right? That's a core operating system function. So why isn't it set up so that in OS 10, when I use that functionality and it knows that I'm zoomed in, why doesn't it adjust the menu so that it actually looks like this? Instead of being something that flies off to the right, it expands down. And we do that in responsive designs, right? When we design a menu system, how many of you use mega menus? You know what I mean by mega menus? You have like one little tiny link, and you click on it, and it exposes about 1,000 links in a panel, right? That's because everybody in your organization feels that they need to be represented, and so everybody has to have their link in that panel. When we create those in a responsive way and we collapse things to a narrower width, we do this kind of stuff. Instead of having things fly out to the side, we actually bring it more into a vertical stack. Right? We need to continue to do that. We need to embrace that vertical stack. It is entirely useful for both low vision and mobile users. And this is something that we do this in form design all the time. When we have a typical 3-column layout, we see things like we have our labels on the left, we have our form fields, and then we have the error messages or the advisory text off to the right-hand side. Right? Fairly typical. Well, we set this up so that when the error messages or the advisory text, that's just part of the label. Right? It's just built into the label tag. And when we shrink that down, we just drop those into that vertical stack. So when you're zoomed in and you're using this, when you're magnified, this is the effect you get. Right? If you're in this 3-column layout and you zoom in, where's that error message? Where's that advisory text? It's gone. Right? It's way off to the right-hand side. It might as well not even be there. Does that make sense? Right? So when we do this and we create these responsive designs, we're doing a really good job of making sure that somebody with low vision can experience this in a much better way. And that's a lesson that's not just good for, again, not just good for people with low vision, but people that are on a mobile device. Another lesson, and this is a lesson from just regular desktop design, right? Regular web design. We want to design for quick consumption. Now, this is like it says, it's an iPhone case you can eat if you wanted to. It's made out of rice crackers. It was from Japan. This is a story on CNN. The thing that I love about this is that they front load the content so that the very first thing that you get on that page is a quick 3-bullet summary of what the story is about. We front load content all the time at a page level, but also at a micro level. We want to do that because we want people to decide, after they read the headline, do I really want to read this article about an iPhone case that you can eat, right? So we front load content at a page level. We want to do the same thing at a micro level. And I use this example all the time. I travel a lot, and this is a listing of flights. And one of the things in this interface that I find really troubling is that the interface doesn't listen to the things that I'm telling it. And so if you take a look here, we always have, in a typical flight listing scenario, we have things like sort by price, sort by departure time, sort by duration. So right now I'm sorted by price, and you can see that the price is right up at the front of each record, right, of each flight choice. But when I say that I want to sort by departure time, the departure time is actually buried. Right? Now, price is always important when you're choosing a flight. If I say that I want the shortest flight, I want to sort by duration, why is it that that is buried way down in the middle of that record? Right? If somebody has specifically said, the shortest flight is important to me, we should have that content. And I'm not saying take it away from where it is right now. I'm saying let's do something and let's allow it to bubble up so that we put it in a more logical place. And I think one of the things that I want to do is use headings to your advantage. Right? We design for quick consumption. One of the best things that you can do is to put meaningful content in headings. We always have headings in documents, but one of the things that we can do in an app-like interface, I know it's just a web interface, but something like this where we have the price, let's build that extra piece of information into the heading so that when we say, I'm going to sort by departure time, we actually change it so that we bring that departure time up from the middle of the record and we put it right at the front so that the very first thing in that heading is that it's $1,397 and it's a 10 a.m. departure time. So now, when somebody is using a mobile phone and they are scanning it quickly, right? Cited or not cited, they can see right away what their choices are, what the best choice is. And for somebody that's using a mobile screen reader, having that information in the heading means that they don't have to go, when they've specifically said, I want a certain departure time, they don't have to go and listen to the price and then flick through it 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times to figure out what the departure time is and then move to the next record. Right? We put the most important information right up front in a heading, and that changes everything. It's now entirely more quickly consumable. If we say we want the shortest flight, let's bring that information up to the front. It sounds really obvious, doesn't it? But we're still not doing it. I miss these things all the time when I'm building an interface. So let's take that important information and build it into a heading, and that makes it entirely more scannable and more quickly consumable for everyone. We also have to redefine easy when we're thinking about responsive design and accessibility. How many of you are familiar with these this series of illustrations? This is something that Luke Wroblewski put on his blog, and he's kind of talking about these different phone holding techniques, right? How do people actually hold things? So it's the one-handed cradle, the two-handed cradle, the supported cradle with the finger or the thumb, right? That's doing the work. And based on, depending on the mechanism that you're using to hold the phone, you get these easy, okay, and difficult to hit areas on the screen, in a touch screen. Makes perfect sense. But what it doesn't take into account is that not everybody holds the phone like that. Right? I have a friend named Glenda who has cerebral palsy, and she doesn't hold a phone, but she holds her iPad with kind of an on-top grip. right? And so her thumb is actually working on the top, and she slides it along and types that way, right? It's a completely different grip, and for her, because of that particular grip, there is no easy, right? Everything for her is hard in that interface. And so there's a lot of different components of what makes for an easy interface for somebody with a disability. That the fact that she has to hold it like that in the first place makes it difficult. Now, what do you know about your iPhone, your Android device, your whatever it is that you're using? If it's a touch screen, we have a software keyboard, right? There's a lot of people that don't like that software keyboard. They actually want a hardware, physical, tactile keys, right? There's a lot of people that kind of hold on to that. One of the things that we face as a challenge is this. If you can't see the screen, if you're visually impaired and you're blind, how do you see the buttons when they're software buttons, right? It's very, very tricky, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. One of the things that came out very early on in the Android world was this dialer. This is a phone dialer. That's a software app that sits on the phone. And the idea behind it is, instead of you going to find where the buttons are, the buttons come and find you. So when you launch this phone dialer app, right, in the middle of your old, maybe you don't have this anymore, on a phone with tactile buttons, there's always a little dot or something on the number 5 to let you know where the middle button was. And some of you don't even know what I'm talking about, and that's totally cool. But there's a little dot quite often, just like you have on your keyboard, so that you know where your home row is. This basically means that every dial, you can dial by touching the screen and then moving in the direction of the number that you want. So if you want to dial a 5, you tap on it on the 5 and then let go, right? Wherever you touch the screen, that's going to be 5. So if you touch it in the top left corner, the keyboard basically moves to your first touch, and then you move up, and it adjusts to you. So to dial a 2, you would basically push and then flick up, and that would dial a 2, or add a 2 to the queue for the number. So instead of you finding the buttons can actually find you. Now that was kind of an early third-party Android app. This is now built in to Android, that you actually have an entire menu system that is entirely based on touch. And so if you see, the usual is this is working in the native browser on my Nexus 7, so it's a Chrome browser. And what it actually has is I basically use a gesture. I will swipe down and across, and that will bring up this menu. And it tells me tap and hold to use the menu. And so what happens is I tap and hold, and you can see right now, you see the little white dot in the read from top? So that's where I'm touching, and so that's why it's visually highlighted like that. So that's me telling it, I want to read this entire page from the top, right? Or I can spell the last utterance. So whatever it said, then I can tell it to spell that out if I didn't understand it. Read from the next item. So instead of reading from the top, read from where you are and continue on. And quick navigation basically gives you this entire huge wheel that lets you move around all the items that happen to be in the page. So you touch, and then you rotate. You don't find the buttons. The buttons and the interface components actually come to you. And you can see here on the right-hand side, I touched it in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's where the menu came to, right? These are the kinds of things that we can do with software. And one of the things that I love about that is, does anybody use the app on the iPhone, Path? We've got basically a persistent little fly-out navigation. You push this little plus sign in the bottom left-hand corner, and it basically spreads out like a fan. It gives you all these interface options. Is there something that we could do in a responsive design where we design something like this for touch, right? And it doesn't need to be for people with disabilities. This could be something that everybody can use, right? We use certain web apps now that have created this entire system of shortcut keys, right? Gmail is like that. Well, what if instead of shortcut keys with Gmail, you basically had a gesture that if you double tapped on the screen and held, it would create this flyout menu. And that would be something that you could easily do. Maybe not easily, but you could do that. One of the other important things to understand about people with disabilities and how assistive technology on these mobile devices works is that there's multiple interaction modes. And you need to test, if you're going to actually test, you need to test with those multiple interaction modes. So VoiceOver, Android is the talkback on the Android device is the same. It's gesture-based. And what you have here, if you take a look on the left-hand side, this is the screen of my iPhone, and you can see a big block in the middle. It says landmarks. And then it's like this little dial, right? This is called the web rotor. And what I can do is the gesture is to take 2 fingers, touch the screen, and rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. And that will go through landmarks, headings, links, whatever things I've chosen to be in the web rotor. It's context sensitive, so that if there's no headings in the page, or if there's no landmarks in the page, then the contents of the rotor actually change. What this allows you to do is not consume the page from start to finish all in one shot. What it allows you to do is say, I want to jump around by using the landmarks, or I want to jump around by using the headings. So if I switch into headings mode by turning the rotor, and then I flick up, or I flick up, that was horrible. I flick down or up to move to the previous or the next item that we've chosen in the rotor, right? So when you're building a responsive site, you actually want to set this up and you actually want to test it, because one of the things that we've found is that things are different quite often. The assistive technology behaves differently depending on the interaction mode that you're using. So if you're saying, I want to go from heading to heading or from link to link, and you're using this mechanism, things will behave a little bit differently than if you're using this mechanism, right? So there's another mechanism that is explore by touch. So you can run your finger. It doesn't matter whether it's over the entire OS interface itself or if it's a web page. You can basically run your finger along the screen, and VoiceOver will speak whatever is underneath your finger, right? And then when you hear the item underneath your finger that you want to select, you just double click. So you double tap the screen. And you can also, instead of explore by touch, you can just flick. So you can flick to the right, you can flick to the left, and it will not, it will just go to whatever the next item is. It doesn't matter what type of item or what type of object it is. It will just go to the next object, period. That's a little bit different than that landmark or that heading navigation, because you're actually saying, I just want to do this with headings, so take me to the next heading. And then we double tap to activate. These are some of the things that if you're going to get into testing for accessibility with responsive designs, that you kind of need to understand. There's a whole entire section that we've got. We're putting a tutorial together about how to set up VoiceOver so that you can test it on your iPhone and on your iPad. Basically, because there's a few things that you need to do and that you need to get set up to get the rotor to work properly. Some other lessons. These are things that kind of threw us for a bit of a loop as we were working with things. If you change the layout of something, we're usually thinking in terms of responsive designs about changing the CSS, right? That's basically what we're doing. But one of the things that we actually need to think about a little bit more is, if we're changing the layout, what do we need to do to change the interaction? And so by the interaction, I mean that we may actually need to change the way that it behaves, the markup itself, the source order, alt text on images. We may need to change the state of something. We were working with a system that was, again, a mega menu system, where on the desktop it was completely exposed. And then when you shrunk it down to about a tablet size, it kind of collapsed on itself and gave you a second set of options, so that it would, instead of clicking and showing the entire panel, you clicked on the top level item to show a list of options underneath that, and then you clicked again to show a second level. So all the things that were in the panel. And that required entirely different keyboard interaction. Right? So when you're setting up a mega menu, you have an entire set of keystrokes that are available to you. And so if I pull up, how do I get this over there? There we go. So this mega menu, if I click on this, you can see this whole huge panel expand. But this has a specific interaction to it. When I start tabbing through the site and I get to one of these items, I can click on that and it will expand that mega menu, right? So that click and expand and show all of that content is very different interaction than if I were to take the browser and shrink it down to this. Right? We've created a different set of content. We've created a different interaction. We've created a different visual treatment. We need to actually think about, well, what are the keyboard keystrokes that I need to include now? Right? What do I do with that second level? They've actually taken the top level here. They don't have any of that extra stuff in the panel showing up. Right? They go straight from the full mega menu to this tiny little menu. Right? A lot of sites are using sort of this intermediate, an intermediate stage. So if you take a look at this, I'm at a stage where I'm kind of at the intermediate stage because of the width of screen for projection. So it normally exists like a big mega menu. In this case, when I click, I get two different levels. Right? So they've taken all of that mega menu and they've now broken it down. Instead of saying it's just one big mega menu, it's actually two different levels of menus. And then when I take it another level down, it collapses completely in an entirely different way. Each one of those iterations, small, medium, and large glass, each one of those iterations requires different keyboard interaction because of the way that it looks. Right? The way that something looks gives you clues as to how you should interact with it. And so we need to, as we're mocking things up, as we're working on a design, and we say, here's the 1200 pixel wide version, here's the 720 pixel wide version, here's the 320 pixel wide version. We need to specify exactly what the keyboard interaction should be. Part of the reason that responsive helps with accessibility is that some people with low vision, and I know I keep coming back to low vision, but some people with low vision work on 27-inch monitors at an 800 by 600 resolution to get the size that they need for iconography, for typography. So the fact that we're building things that work, and we may think, well, something that is 800, something that's 800 pixels wide, well, that's not going to be a desktop, that's going to be a tablet. Entirely not true. Right? You could have somebody working on a 640 by 480 desktop still. I know that's painful to hear, but it could happen. Right? So we need to design for those things. We need to take into account keyboard interaction and take into account all of these other things. What role does something have? When you have content that exists as a heading, right, in that mega menu, typically what we do within that panel is we'll have headings that go over top of a group of links. Right? When you shrink that down and make it narrower, we tend to collapse that content. And now you saw in the mid-size on the Target website, you saw in the mid-size, all those things that would have been headings are now something that you can click on to expand a section. So they're not headings anymore, are they? They're headings, but they're also links. So their role in the interface has changed, and we need to make sure that the markup reflects that. We need to sometimes change the source order. We sometimes need to change the alt text because of just a layout change. This is a bizarre one, and we saw this when we were testing a particular site. When you change orientation on a phone from portrait to landscape, or from landscape to portrait, some interesting things happen depending on the techniques that you've used. You really need to watch out for something like this. This is, again, that same site. Can you see up at the top, you see the logo right in the middle? They've used an image replacement technique. So they've got text in behind there, and they've got a logo that's being put in the page. And then do you see the box that's kind of off to the right-hand side? That box that's off to the right-hand side, that thin black border, that's the voiceover cursor. So the voiceover cursor is not like a physical cursor. So when you're using your computer and you're tabbing through the page, you're actually moving a physical cursor around the page, right? The voiceover cursor is a virtual cursor that is on top of the screen. Okay? It's not exactly tied to a keyboard, because in this case there is no keyboard. This is a gesture-based interface. So that cursor right now, that voiceover cursor that you can see, is what it looks like when you're focused on that particular logo in the middle of the screen. And that's because the words are hidden with a particular technique. So the logo is showing, but the focus is on the words. So you don't see the words on the screen, but VoiceOver is actually focusing on the words. Now, here's what makes it worse. Can you see on the very right-hand side, there's some text. There's actually a link up in the top right-hand corner. And the link is overlapped by the text that was there. So from a VoiceOver perspective, you're listening to this interface. You can't see what you're tapping on, but you hear the company name, and when you double tap, the virtual cursor is actually over top of another link. So instead of activating the link that you think you're activating, you're actually activating a different link, because that physical or that virtual cursor is overlapping something else. So be aware of this. This is something that happens, that it will probably happen in responsive designs that isn't going to happen elsewhere, particularly on a phone size when you move from landscape to portrait. Things that we need to keep in mind. Sliding animations are horrible. If you're building a responsive site on either a tablet or something that's designed for tablet, or let's just say this. Stop making things slide and animate, okay, period. Now, if you can't do that, at least make that happen on phones and tablets, because what happens with sliding animations, and this is a sliding animation, this is a pretty typical too much content pattern. So when we get to narrower widths, there's patterns where we say, take that extra content and move it off to the left, or move it off to the right. And you see on the left-hand side here, you see the black line that's going all the way down the left-hand side, or almost all the way down the left-hand side. That is content that is off the screen, that has been slid. Yeah, it's been slid off the screen, but it's taking the focus. And what happens when you have content that is off the screen, that takes the focus? It's off the screen. And so the very next thing that happens when you focus on content that's off the screen is VoiceOver, that virtual cursor basically says, I don't know what to do. You're making me focus on something that's not really within the bounds of the screen, so I don't know what to do. So what it actually does is it takes the focus from being off screen and sends it back up to the top. And it forces the person to start all over again. So if they've been flicking through or choosing, using the rotor, moving down through heading and heading, or from one heading to the next, or from one link to the next, that focus goes off the screen. VoiceOver basically says, I don't like this, start over. Right? It's an incredibly difficult, horrible experience. We've seen this testing with real people, where they've actually been trying to activate a menu, and it's taken literally 10 tries to get to one link and make it work, because it's this content that's off the screen, and it's been sliding and animated in and out as you click on that more link. Couple more, and then we'll wrap it up. One of the techniques that we use is a tab index technique. We use this on the desktop in regular web browsers all the time. We need to manage the focus. So you guys know what I'm talking about in terms of managing focus. If you have like a dialogue, yeah? Some people. So if you have a dialogue that comes up on the screen, so if I'm using this as a dialogue, and bear with me, when you click on the please log in link and it shows a dialogue, we need to actually manage the focus and bring the focus to that dialogue. Because if we don't do that, the person that's using a keyboard and tabbing through the page, they're going to go through all the content that's in the background instead of being able to go through the dialogue that's there. So we use a technique where we put a tab index of -1 on that div, and if you take a look, I'll move back here, the href on that link is actually a href equals pound login, and that href points to an element in the page, and it points to that div. So when we put a tab index of -1 on that, and we have an href that's pointing to it, we can use JavaScript then to trap that click and say, go find this thing in the page and put the focus there. So giving it a tab index of -1 and saying, giving it the tab index and then saying, go and focus on it, actually brings the focus inside that particular div, right? Then we can interact with it and go programmatically through. We can tab through the username, the password field, the continue button, the close button, all of those things. This tab index technique doesn't work on mobile. It's a critical technique. And so one of the things that I want to kind of leave you with or have you thinking about is, if that technique doesn't work, and this is basically for a modal, right? And I'm gonna quiz you because I know I'm gonna get some questions. So I'm gonna ask you a question. If you were to do this on a responsive site, what would the interaction be for a modal, right? How would you design this, knowing that tab index doesn't work and we can't physically bring the cursor there to focus on it? What would you do? How can you make it? The entire purpose of a modal is that it basically says, interact with this thing and nothing else, right? So how could you do that on a mobile? I'll give you 5 seconds to think about it. 3, 2, 1. Any thoughts? A different page, or even a view that basically makes it like, the modal in this case on the desktop doesn't take up the entire thing, right? It doesn't take up the entire screen, the entire viewport. And that's why we do this graying out thing and we isolate the focus. Well, what if we just bring up another div that basically fills the entire viewport so that there's nothing except that thing to connect with, right? We just take over. So a modal dialogue on a mobile site, a mobile modal, should effectively take up the whole screen, right? And we need to build things so that it actually does do that. How many of you are familiar with Flexbox? Do you love it? You might want to think again a little bit about it. I like the technique. I think it's kind of cool that we can have the box orientation where we can, or the ordinal number for the box to say what order things go in. But all tests that we've done on Flexbox content, where you're moving content around by changing the CSS and by changing that order with the CSS, is not respected in any way, shape, or form by screen readers. So the mobile screen readers and desktop screen readers, they don't get that CSS orientation. Now, in some cases, that may be a big deal. In some cases, that may not be a big deal. Right? It really depends on the context. But if you're moving a piece of content and you're expecting it to be in a certain place, then you want to make sure that the source order follows that as much as possible. There's a lot of different things that happen with mobile sites and with desktop sites that we don't even think about. And one of those things is support calls, right? If you're building something and there's a support team that answers support calls for that, I want you to think about what the person that's on the support call is going to have to go through. And so envision a scenario. How many of you could take a link, right, just a plain old HTML link, and how many of you could style it and make it look like a button? Good. Okay, if anybody didn't put your hand up, we can have another class outside afterwards. But you can take a link and make it look like a button, right? And when you're writing the manual and the script for support, they're going to say things like, click on the save button, right? Click on the create new whatever button. They're going to say in that script, click on that button because it looks like a button. But if it's a link, a screen reader user will not be able to recognize it as a button because it will be a link to them. Just because it looks a certain way doesn't mean it actually is that thing. Right? A link is a link and a button is a button. And so if you're creating something that looks like a button, you should maybe just consider making it a button. I know that doesn't always fly, but it's one of the things that we need to think about. We really need to think about the way that things look on the screen and the way that they actually are. Right? We need to make sure that the order that things appear on the screen follows the order that a screen reader would go through things. They're expecting things to be in a certain order, and if the order that they experience is different than the order that somebody else experiences that's not using that technology, then we're creating a gap there. Right? All right. What time is it really right now? Because for me, it's almost 4 in the morning, and so I'm a little bit fuzzy. Okay. So how are we? Okay. Well, because the timing is actually, I think, perfect because I was going to say that's 10 lessons, but I'm happy to answer questions, and we can certainly talk about this some more.
I'm glad you're happy to answer questions. There were a few that popped up. Good talk, very good. It's nice to see that get the discussion and stuff that I think it kind of goes under-discussed and far too often. I'll start right away with the one that like 10 people all asked. You hit a nerve with the sliding off canvas thing. Is that there was a couple questions there. So one is that something that you can kind of deal with proper use of like ARA roles, or like can you do like an ARA hidden kind of thing on there? Does that help the issue, or?
So it depends on what the issue is. If it's an off-screen thing, what we generally do is if you're going to slide it off. Should I talk to you or should I talk to them?
Talk to them.
Okay, good, because I don't really want to talk to you. No, I don't. No, they're more important. If you're going to slide it off the screen, that's fine. But when you get to the point where it is actually off the screen, do something to make it display none rather than be just positioned off to the left. If you want to use those transitions to slide things, the general rule that we use is if it's not on the screen, it shouldn't be exposed. And so what we don't want is a scenario where something is hidden with visibility hidden or just positioned off to the left. We actually want, when it's off the screen, to make it display none. Right? And that has a huge impact so that you don't get the cursor going to items that are off the screen. So what you would do in that case, when we had the more link at the top left, what you would actually do is when you click on that, you would make those things display block again and then slide them in. When they slide off, let them slide off and then display none so that they're no longer exposed in the DOM, basically.
But that partially on canvas, partially off kind of layout that, like the Windows interface thing that everybody kind of latched onto because it's kind of cool, right? You wouldn't be able to do that because you'd still have to have the display, but there's not really a way around that?
Not right now.
Is that, so then the other question that came out of this, is this more of a bug in VoiceOver, or is it actually like an anti-pattern kind of a thing?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's an anti-pattern. I'm sure there are solutions that we can, that we can come up with and figure out. But it's something where, I think it's ultimately the best solution right now is, still have it slide off. If you collapse it, you can still bring it back in fairly quickly. So I don't think people are going to miss that aspect of it.
How does the how do things work? You had mentioned like changing the source order. One of the common ways that people do that with the responsive design is on the front end. They'll take some JavaScript and manipulate the source order that way.
Yep.
How does that work out in terms of accessibility?
That's generally fine. So using JavaScript, people used to say that JavaScript is bad and it doesn't, it's not good for accessibility. But that's really just not true. It's pretty much flat out false. So those changes to the DOM that you make by doing a wraparound or something like that to create some new items or just injecting new stuff into the DOM, usually that will work and it'll be just fine. It depends on what creates it. So if there's a click event, then screen readers will update their buffer to recognize those new elements that have been inserted. And if they don't, you can actually have there's a buffer, an update buffer method that you can use that will deal with older screen readers that don't keep in sync, so that when you slide something or when you resize and those items or the activity happens with an on-resize event, then the buffer will update as well. So generally speaking, should be totally fine.
And the last one before we let PPK do his thing is, because I think Flexbox is something that a lot of people are really, really excited about. So to hear that is such a issue for accessibility is a little, kind of like, it's a little bit of a disheartening thing. Is there something in the works to counter that? Because that seems like such a powerful tool to not be able to wield.
Yeah, well, ultimately what needs to happen for that is that screen readers, and the biggest issue will be screen readers, people that can't see the screen. That technology is kind of always changing, so ultimately that will be something with Flexbox being part of specs. It just takes a while, unfortunately, for screen readers and other assistive technology to kind of get caught up.
Sure.
So that is something that it'll sort itself out. Don't quote me on that. I can't guarantee that, because I don't make screen readers, but that is something that down the road that should be taken care of.
I think we can be particularly forgiving of that, considering that Flexbox has been through like 35 different versions by now of the spec, so that's all right.
Yeah.
All right, so Derek, there's more questions and stuff, but we're going to get on with PPK, so thank you, sir.
Thank you.